In the shown intro of the video, American explorers encountered the Korubo people, who live in the Javari Valley of the Amazonian rainforest. The Korubo, just as hundreds of other tribes all over the planet, have chosen to sever all contact with the outside world. Industrial companies, such as oil refineries and lumbering factories, have brought violence, destruction, and disease to the living habits of indigenous people. Bulldozers destroy forests that had been the sphere of life for those demographic groups for decades. Consequently, the relationships between the Western industrial states and indigenous populations deteriorated. Ornai was expelled from his home forest a few years ago.
I'm very worried about this destruction, because we don't know exactly where the people still in the forest are living. I have a sister among them. This is why we don't want the white people to destroy more of the forest with their bulldozers.
This is a startling example that indigenous people generalize a race as the whites, and the only associations they make with the Western world are barbaric characteristics and destructive behavior. This is a juxtaposition to the self-perception of the Western world that calls itself in a state of modernization and progress. To understand the reason why the indigenous people are afraid of the industrial states, which is totally justified, one needs to put the situation into a historical context. It was the so-called Columbian Exchange that got the ball for the centuries-long exploitation of the cultural knowledge of indigenous people rolling. To start, one needs to internalize a brief historical summary about this event. The term Columbian Exchange goes back to the research of the historian Alfred W. Crosby during the 1970s and generally refers to the exchange of disease, flora and fauna, food, crops, and populations between the Eastern and the Western Hemisphere. It occurs as one of the consequences of the European expansion after the encounter of America by Christopher Columbus in 1492. Both the Old and the New World have benefited from the encounter. Animals such as horses, pigs, and cattle became vital as working animals and nourishments in the New World. Rather than leading a nomadic lifestyle, indigenous people could now travel faster from A to B, and the newly obtained animals allowed them to hunt on the back of horses. Afro-Eurasia made big usage of maize and potato, and the Americas got to know to wheat, rice, and sugar. More broadly, no society on Earth could escape from the influences. However, there was another side of the coin. The white explorers brought diseases, under which smallpox was the most infectious one. The Native Americans were not immune to those viruses and died in millions. Consequently, the European explorers shipped millions of slaves from Africa in order to be able to maintain the economy. Thereby, they started the triangular slave trade over the Atlantic. Fortunately, rights of indigenous people have gotten a lot of attention in the last few years, and the legal statutes of industrial nations such as the United States have taken a step away from social inequality and a step towards equal social advancement opportunities. In 2007, the UN headquarters adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Even whole conventions on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination took place. Although not all of these rights aim at the root of the problem, as the adopted laws are not all focusing on the real indigenous interest, such as land rootedness and land property, this was a step into the right direction. The declaration by the United Nations takes states into active responsibility by expecting them to provide effective mechanisms for the prevention of any kind of discrimination of indigenous people. However, even in today's world, the issue is still present. Typing indigenous people's issues into Google leads you to a website listing the 5 most shocking instances connected to indigenous issues every week. For instance, the extrajudicial killing of William Bugatti, a human rights activist in the Philippines who had received threats for his life for over a year from state security forces. A mysterious epidemic similar to tuberculosis is steadily killing recently contacted members of a South American tribe. Those Indians are being forced out of their forest as cattle ranchers burn and clear the land. This list goes on and on and on. Thus, one's main motivation should be to get rid of this inexplicable rank indigenous people have to suffer from day and day. From a human rights perspective, simply rights have to be granted for everyone, and not be a quid pro quo for assimilating to the superior culture. especially not for a culture that actually managed to live in interdependence with nature and perpetuate their cultural distinctiveness as a community, along with respect and recognition for the cultural heritages of other civilizations. Let's save cultural diversity. Let's save these innocent lives. Let's assure humanity.